January 1967. High in the cool hills of Aburi, Ghana, Nigeria's most powerful military officers sit around the same table for the first time in months. Outside, the country they govern is dangerously close to collapse. 2 coups have shattered the army. Thousands of civilians have been killed. Families have fled across regional borders. Soldiers no longer trust one another, and the eastern region no longer accepts the authority of the government in Lagos. Yet inside the conference room, there are no gunshots. There are handshakes. There is laughter. There is even champagne. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, Nigeria's military ruler, sits across from Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Ojukwu, the military governor of the eastern region. Between them stands Ghana's leader, Lieutenant General Joseph Ankara, who has brought the Nigerian commanders together in the hope that dialogue can succeed where force has failed. For 2 days, on the 4th and 5th of January, the men discuss the future of Nigeria. They agree to reorganize the army. They agree to reduce the power of the central government. They agree that major national decisions should require the participation of the regional military governors. Most importantly, they solemnly renounce force as a way of settling the crisis. When the meeting ends, the atmosphere is so hopeful that the agreement is toasted with champagne. The official record declares that the council has reached agreement on every item placed before it. 6 months later, Nigeria is at war. So what happened? How did a meeting that ended in apparent agreement become another step toward catastrophe? Was the Aburi Accord deliberately betrayed? Was it misunderstood? Or did 2 leaders leave the same room believing they had agreed to 2 completely different versions of Nigeria? This was not just another political conference. It may have been the final deal standing between Nigeria and the Biafran War. Nigeria had gained independence from Britain in 1960, but the new country inherited deep structural tensions. It was governed as a federation, divided among powerful regions, each dominated by different political interests and ethnic majorities. The northern region was the largest. The western region was politically turbulent. The eastern region was dominated by the Igbo, but also contained many minority communities, particularly in the oil-producing Niger Delta. Competition over federal power became increasingly bitter. Elections were disputed. Political violence spread. Accusations of corruption and regional domination weakened confidence in the civilian government. Then, on January 15, 1966, a group of young army officers launched Nigeria's first military coup. Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was killed. Northern Premier Ahmadu Bello was killed. Western Premier Samuel Akintola was also killed. Several senior military officers died. Although the coup plotters claimed they were attacking corruption, most of the leading conspirators were Igbo, while many of the most prominent victims were northern and western leaders. The coup itself failed to take full control of the country, but Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, an Igbo and the most senior surviving army officer, assumed power. Ironsi inherited a country filled with suspicion. Many northerners believed the coup had been an ethnic conspiracy, particularly because prominent Igbo political and military figures had survived. Those suspicions deepened when Ironsi failed to bring the coup leaders quickly to trial. In May 1966, Ironsi issued Decree No. 34, replacing Nigeria's federal structure with a more centralized system. Ironsi presented the change as a way to strengthen national unity. In much of the north, however, it was interpreted as an attempt to destroy regional autonomy and place the entire country under an Igbo-dominated central government. Violence followed. In July 1966, northern officers launched a counter-coup. Ironsi was abducted and killed alongside the military governor of the Western region, Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajuyi. Hundreds of Igbo soldiers and officers were murdered inside the army. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon emerged as the new head of the federal military government. But Ojukwu refused to recognize the manner in which Gowon had taken power. From the Eastern perspective, the army's chain of command had been destroyed, and Gowon was not the most senior surviving officer. The crisis then moved beyond the barracks. During 1966, waves of anti-Igbo and anti-Eastern violence swept through parts of northern Nigeria. The exact number killed remains disputed, but the massacres were extensive enough to produce a vast movement of frightened survivors toward the east. Trains and lorries arrived carrying traumatized families, wounded civilians, and, in some cases, the bodies of those who had been killed. For many Easterners, the lesson was devastating. The Nigerian state could no longer guarantee their safety. By the end of 1966, Nigeria still existed on the map, but the army was divided. The regions were governing themselves with increasing independence, and the trust required to hold the country together had almost disappeared.
Ojukwu would not travel to Lagos for negotiations. He feared for his safety and refused to enter a territory where Gowon controlled the soldiers and the machinery of government. Gowon, meanwhile, could not simply travel to Enugu and appear to accept the East's rejection of federal authority. A neutral location was needed. Ghana offered one. The meeting was held at Paduase Lodge near Aburi, north of Accra. Ghana's leader, Lieutenant General Joseph Ankra, acted as host and mediator. Ankra carefully described the crisis as an internal Nigerian matter, but reminded the officers that millions of people depended on them to find a peaceful solution. Gowon attended with the military governors of the North, West, and Midwest, alongside senior federal officials and military advisors. Ojukwu arrived representing the Eastern region. The symbolism was important. For months, Ojukwu had refused to attend meetings of the Supreme Military Council inside Nigeria. At Aburi, the senior military leaders were finally together again. But beneath the polite atmosphere lay profound disagreement. The East no longer accepted that one man could exercise effective command over the entire Nigerian army. Eastern officers had been killed in large numbers. Soldiers had retreated toward their regions of origin. Units were increasingly identified with particular parts of the country rather than with Nigeria as a whole. There was also the question of arms. Ojukwu accused the federal authorities of importing weapons and storing them in the north. Federal representatives, in turn, accused the East of conducting its own military buildup. The officers were not negotiating in peace. They were negotiating while preparing for the possibility that peace would fail. Even so, the first major decision was extraordinary. The members unanimously declared that they would renounce the use of force, rely on negotiation, and exchange information about weapons held across the regions. They also agreed that further arms imports should stop until normal conditions returned. For the first time in months, Nigeria's leaders appeared to be moving away from war.
The central question at Aburi was simple but dangerous. Who truly controlled Nigeria? Gowon headed the federal military government. But Ojukwu argued that after the counter-coup, the massacres, and the collapse of the army's command structure, meaningful authority could no longer be concentrated in Lagos. The solution reached at Aburi was to make the Supreme Military Council the country's highest collective authority. This meant that major decisions affecting all of Nigeria would not be made by Gowon alone. They would be referred to the Supreme Military Council, where the regional governors would participate. When a formal meeting could not be held, matters affecting the whole country
would still be sent to the governors for their comments and concurrence. The language sounded administrative, but its meaning was enormous. It placed limits on the power of the federal head of government. The army would also be reorganized. Instead of operating as one centrally controlled institution, it would have area commands corresponding to the existing regions. Military headquarters would include equal regional representation. During military rule, regional governors would control their area commands in matters of internal security. Senior appointments in the armed forces, police, diplomatic service, federal civil service, and public corporations would require approval from the Supreme Military Council. The regional representatives also called for the repeal of decrees issued after the January 1966 coup that had reduced regional authority. This directly challenged the centralizing measures introduced under Ironsi. The men discussed political prisoners, constitutional negotiations, displaced people, unpaid salaries, abandoned property, and the movement of soldiers back toward their regions of origin. They agreed that inflammatory government broadcasts should stop. They also agreed that the Constitutional Committee suspended during the violence should resume its work. To Ojukwu, the meaning was clear. Nigeria would survive only as a loose association of powerful regions. Lagos could not command the East without the East's consent. The federal center would remain, but its authority would be sharply restricted. To Gowon, the agreement did not necessarily destroy the federation. Nigeria would remain one country, but the regions would receive safeguards intended to restore confidence. That difference was crucial. Ojukwu believed Aburi had fundamentally restructured Nigeria. Gowon believed Aburi had created temporary measures for managing a national emergency. The official wording did not use the term confederation, nor did it give the East a right to secede. But the requirement that decisions affecting the whole country receive regional concurrence moved Nigeria toward a much looser political arrangement. For Ojukwu, that was the minimum required to keep the East inside Nigeria. For federal officials, it risked making the central government almost impossible to operate. Yet, inside Aburi, those fears did not prevent agreement. The meeting ended cordially. The final communiqué announced agreement on all agenda items. Official reporters had recorded the proceedings, and tape-recorded versions were distributed to the governments involved. The successful outcome was celebrated with champagne. At that moment, the country had not been reunited, but war had been postponed, and perhaps, for one brief moment, prevented. The trouble began after the delegations returned home. In Enugu, Ojukwu presented Aburi as a binding agreement that had transformed the relationship between the federal government and the regions. The Eastern message became simple and powerful. On Aburi, we stand. In Lagos, however, federal civil servants and legal advisors examined the implications more carefully. They warned that the agreement, if implemented according to Ojukwu's interpretation, could reduce the federal government to little more than a coordinating office. Every region could potentially block national decisions. Military unity would become difficult to restore. The federal government might be unable to respond to an emergency inside a region without the cooperation of that region's governor. Nigeria would remain one country in name, but its central authority could become too weak to function. This is where the debate over betrayal begins. Supporters of the Eastern position argue that Gowon understood the agreement, accepted it, and later withdrew after federal advisors showed him how much power he had surrendered. Defenders of Gowon argue that Ojukwu stretched the agreement beyond what had been intended, presenting temporary safeguards as the creation of a confederation. there is evidence that misunderstanding played a role. In a later conversation recorded by an American diplomat, the possibility was raised that military officers without professional negotiating experience had left Aburi with sincerely different interpretations. Ojukwu rejected that suggestion. He insisted that the recorded proceedings made the agreement clear and that the East would not abandon its understanding of what had been settled. But misunderstanding alone does not explain everything. The problem was also political. Gowon was not operating in isolation. Northern leaders, military officers, and senior federal officials feared the disintegration of Nigeria. Accepting Ojukwu's interpretation could encourage other regions to demand similar independence from Lagos. Ojukwu also faced enormous pressure. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Easterners had returned home. Survivors were demanding protection and justice. Many no longer believed coexistence was possible. Any concession that restored federal control without firm regional safeguards could look like surrender. Neither leader had much room to retreat. Each side also controlled its own information machinery. Federal and Eastern broadcasts presented competing accounts of what had happened. Instead of one agreement rebuilding trust, Aburi became a weapon in a propaganda battle. The federal government insisted it was willing to implement the spirit of the accord. The East insisted that only exact implementation was acceptable. A peace agreement designed to end the crisis had become a new source of accusation.
On the 17th of March 1967, the federal military government issued Decree No. 8, officially presented as the legal instrument implementing Aburi. But Ojukwu rejected it. From the federal perspective, the decree granted substantial regional authority while preserving Nigeria's ability to function as one country. From the Eastern perspective, it rewrote the agreement. The most controversial provisions concerned emergency powers. The decree allowed the federal authorities, under specified conditions, to declare a state of emergency and intervene in a region. To Ojukwu, this destroyed the protection Aburi had supposedly created. Lagos could claim to respect regional autonomy while retaining the power to override it during a crisis. Ojukwu also objected to the proposed composition and operation of the Supreme Military Council. In discussions with an American official, he said the emergency clauses, the council's composition, and the timing of the decree were among the major problems. He claimed Ghanaian officials had identified dozens of differences between the decree and the Aburi agreements. By then, events were moving faster than diplomacy. The East began withholding federal revenues. Lagos introduced economic measures against the region. Both sides strengthened their military positions. The language of negotiation gave way to ultimatums. On 27 May 1967, Gowon announced the creation of 12 states, replacing the old regional structure. The decision struck directly at Ojukwu's authority. The eastern region was divided into 3 states. The new rivers and southeastern states contained many non-Igbo minorities and much of the region's valuable oil-producing territory. Federal leaders argued that state creation protected minority communities from domination by larger ethnic groups. Ojukwu saw it as an attempt to break the East apart before moving against it. 3 days later, on May 30, 1967, Ojukwu declared the eastern region an independent state called the Republic of Biafra. Gowon's government rejected the declaration. On July 6th, federal forces began what Lagos initially described as a limited police action. The Nigerian Civil War had begun.
It is tempting to imagine that one agreement could have prevented everything that followed. The invasions, the blockades, the bombings, the starving children whose images shocked the world, the soldiers killed far from home, the families permanently divided by the war. But history is rarely that simple. Aburi did not remove the fear created by the coups. It did not bring back those murdered in the massacres. It did not restore trust inside the army. It did not settle the struggle over oil, regional power, minority rights, or the legitimacy of Gowon's government. What it did was create a narrow political bridge across all those divisions. For 2 days, Nigeria's military leaders accepted that force could not solve their crisis. They agreed that power had to be shared. They acknowledged that the regions required protection from unchecked central authority. Then they returned home and discovered that the same words carried different meanings. To the east, Aburi was a promise that Nigeria would become a loose union of nearly autonomous regions. To Lagos, it was an emergency compromise that could not be allowed to dismantle the federation. Ojukwu called what followed a betrayal. Gowon maintained that Aburi had never authorized secession or the creation of Biafra. Decades later, their opposing interpretations continued to shape how Nigerians remembered the meeting. Perhaps the deepest tragedy is that the men at Aburi understood how close the country was to war. They discussed the weapons. They discussed the broken army. They discussed the displaced families. They even signed a declaration renouncing force. They knew what failure might mean. And still, they failed. History remembers 30 May 1967, when Biafra declared independence. It remembers 6th July, when the fighting began. But before those dates came 2 quiet days in the hills of Ghana, when the leaders of a divided country sat together, reached across the table, and briefly believed that Nigeria could still be saved. The Aburi Accord did not end the crisis, but it may have been the last deal that could have prevented the Biafran War.